Do I think this budget will meet the definition of austerity? Yes, I do. I'm Richard Murphy. I'm Professor of Accounting Practice at Sheffield University Management School and a political economist.
So can you talk to me about Starmer's speech yesterday? We were told that we're going to have a very painful autumn budget this October. What were your first impressions?
I listened to and then read Starmer's speech to make sure I got it right, because the first reaction was, it can't be that bad. And the second reaction was, yes, it is. What is he saying? He's saying basically that the Tories left the whole country in a mess and there's nothing he can do about it, as if he has no choices left available, because the Treasury won't let him spend any money. And all of this is going to lead to, as he put it, pain on behalf of all of us who are living in the UK. And there is no reason for any of that, is my reaction. So my sentiment on listening to this was, this is a man who, first of all, breaks the mold of all previous Labour prime ministers, because he comes in without hope. And that surely is the definition of what a Labour prime minister should be. And secondly, he comes in accepting that there is effectively nothing that he can do, because Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak have apparently stitched him up, and therefore his ability to govern does not exist. Why did we bother electing him, is my question.
Is that any different to the line that he gave us during the election? I know that he hammered home this idea of change, but he did warn the public that it would be very difficult, in his first 100 days.
Well, he says this is different, and I'm going to, in a sense, accept his word for that. Now, that might, of course, be naive of me, but he claims that they did not know there was a £22 billion, as he calls it, black hole in the government's finances at the time that they took over. Although everybody who I know who commented on the budget in March suggested that a figure of around that scale did exist, and you only had to read the OBR report at the time to believe that the figures which are being published by them on behalf of Jeremy Hunt did not add up. It was glaringly obvious they couldn't. He was forecasting a 1% increase in spending on departments, or for government departments. That wasn't clearly going to happen. It was obvious that there was going to need to be more spending than that. And therefore, I think that he should have known that there was a deficit. But he claims that this is news to them, and he claims it is news to the OBR. Well, that's, again, disingenuous of him. That's the best I will say of what he has represented about the OBR. Why is it disingenuous? Because the OBR is only allowed to use the figures it's given. The OBR does not actually create the figures. It comments upon what the Treasury gives it. So it said in March that it didn't think the figures were credible. It didn't, and was not asked to say at the time that there was a deficit which was unfunded, because that is beyond its remit. So to now claim that they've discovered something since then which they didn't know about is pretty fanciful on his part. But he nonetheless claims that this reframes how he and Rachel Reeves are looking at the role of government over the next few years, because they haven't got the money left. I don't believe them. There is clearly money available, but they say that they haven't got it, and that's what matters, because after all, they are ultimately the people who write the checks.
Well, also, when we talk about not having the money available, I mean, I suppose you could argue that there is always a political choice with what money is available, how that is spent. And, a couple of the announcements that we've heard already, we know that there are going to be above inflation public sector pay rises. Is that a good way to be spending the quote unquote limited money that apparently is in the pot?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I would totally support above inflation public sector pay rises. Why? Because public sector employees have had below inflation pay rises for a long time. If we look at the junior doctors, it was genuinely true that their pay had, since 2010, fallen dramatically compared to what it was at that time. There were junior doctors earning £15 an hour, which is only a bit above minimum wage, which was ridiculous given the antisocial hours that many of them are expected to work, including weekends. So the minimum wage is not set taking those factors into account. And frankly, there was almost any job that you like to think of where a junior doctor could make more money than they could by working a night shift to look after people who needed care. So to suggest that it was a mistake to pay them a pay rise is absurd. I don't call train drivers at present public sector employees because it's still ambiguous who precisely controls the franchises which pay them. But the point is that the train drivers dispute had to be resolved, and there were clear issues that did require resolution. And in the future, there are major problems which require public sector pay to go up, because the basic fact is that recruitment and retention in very many public sector jobs is incredibly difficult. I know a lot of teachers. I know a lot of university teachers as well, given my own job. And it is very difficult to keep people doing what are actually, despite the rumours that are put around by the free market think tanks, quite difficult jobs for relatively low pay when there are other options available. I mean, I have a friend who's a teacher who's gone off to become a recruitment consultant. I'm not sure what benefit he's adding to society by being a recruitment consultant, but he could no longer make ends meet and face the demands being put upon him as a primary school teacher. And that was his personal choice as to how to manage that. Now, if that's the case, you've got to put up pay to compensate people to stay in what are difficult jobs. And I personally would not want to stand in front of up to 39-year-olds for many hours a day, many weeks in a row, as primary school teachers are required to do. I have met plenty of 9-year-olds in my time, including my own. And the idea of standing in front of them all day would not appeal to me. So, en masse, and we've got to be realistic about this. If we ask people to do difficult jobs, then we should pay them for them. And if we don't, we won't have public services. So Labour has, in the sense that it said it's going to do these things, done the right thing. But let's add the caveat now. There's been an attachment, which is you can have the pay rise, but effectively your school is now underfunded because it's got to make cuts elsewhere. Most schools can't make cuts elsewhere if they give their teachers pay rises. All they can do is cut out support work, which means that children with special educational needs don't get the support that they require, which is absurd. I mean, I'm a former chair of governors of primary schools. Let me put that experience on the table. For many years in central London, I know that children won't get the support they need with English as a second language, because that won't be on the table either. There will be all sorts of needs unmet as a consequence of doing this. We will have the childcare facility of primary school in place, which is what I think most politicians think it's all about, because that enables people to go to work, which we know is Keir Starmer's obsession, maximising the number of people in the workplace. It's also Wes Streeting's obsession with healthcare. But that isn't what education is about. Believe it or not, it's actually about training young people to be useful members of society. But they rather forget that bit. And they always assume that everyone is normal. I don't know many normal people. I know people who are on a range from pretty abnormal in some directions to pretty abnormal in other directions, and I fit somewhere within that scope, and we all do. But they assume that there's this little thing that we can put in a hole and teach a standard curriculum. Wrong. And they are making that assumption when offering these pay rises. So from the outset, Labour is making some very big assumptions which aren't terribly clear as yet, which are going to make the provision of public services very hard, even if they do give the necessary pay rises.
And even if they do give those necessary pay rises, you've still got the issue of, as you've already said, underfunded, facilities, underfunded institutions. So is there an argument that it's almost counterproductive, particularly when there's a lot of emphasis from Labour on retention and improving retention rates across the NHS, across teaching staff, that, well, one of the big issues that those public sector workers face is that they physically can't do the job in a lot of cases, and they feel quite drilled down because their institutions are falling apart around them. So even if they give the pay rises, is it counterproductive to not fix, say, the facilities?
Well, I had an image come to mind, which is of a hospital about 30 miles from where I happen to be sitting at the moment, which is King's Lynn Hospital, the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in King's Lynn in Norfolk, which was just above Liz Truss's old constituency. That hospital is held up by 1,500 poles at the moment because the roof is literally falling down and they don't know where it's going to fall down next. So they have these scaffolding poles to hold the roof up internally. Now, who wants to work in a place which is held up by scaffolding poles? Because the next time you're doing an operation, it might be your operating theatre where the ceiling falls down. That is pretty demotivational. I would never have provided that facility in the private sector and expected somebody to come to work. Why do it in the state sector? And the reality is that putting these things right would actually provide the growth that Keir Starmer says is his obsession. Because what we need to do is put people to work doing activities which are of social benefit for the people of this country to deliver what people need. And it's my belief that now most people do not want to have another iPhone or another iPad or whatever else, but actually are really very desperate for there to be better education, better healthcare, and so on, because they know the cost of the alternative is incredibly high. They also know, in many cases, that the cost of underfunding is that they themselves are brought into direct hardship. For example, I recently became an old age pensioner, much to my own surprise. But as a result, well, how did that happen? I keep on asking myself, where did I make it to 66? But I know a lot of people as a result who spent a lot of time in their sort of last decade or so, my friendship with them, looking after very aged parents because social care has no facility for people of their parents' age. And that is a cause of massive underproduction in the economy. It's a completely false economy not to provide care for elderly people who could otherwise live at home, but who then demand that a child is around, child in their 50s or 60s still, and I have friends who still have parents alive in their 60s, because there's a risk they might just fall over. But they wouldn't if they were in a daycare centre where they could be looked after and could still be looked after at night somewhere else. So we just get such a failure to look at this. And Wes Streeting appears to have no comprehension that if he doesn't spend money on infrastructure and social care, he will never solve the problems of the NHS. Of course, he also has no comprehension of the fact that if he doesn't spend money cutting the amount of sugar in ultra-processed foods, he also won't get rid of diabetes and obesity and even dementia itself, which is now described as diabetes type 3. There's a failure to integrate all this thinking inside Labour. In fact, the shocking thing about Labour is that they appear to have done no preparation for government, that they've arrived in office and apparently they didn't know there was a deficit. Apparently they don't know why healthcare demands exist. Apparently they don't know the connections between the health service and social care. Apparently they don't know that they've actually got a backlog of repairs, which is as long as your arm, and that they need to fund that to make sure things are done right. They don't know any of this stuff. And you think, what did they do in 14 years of opposition? And I wish I knew the answer to that question because I genuinely don't.
When you talk about sort of, well, ramifications of certain policies not being implemented, what do you think taking away the winter fuel allowance from certain people, well, anyone who is not in receipt of pension credit or other benefits, what ramifications will that have on the public sector?
Of all the things that I could have imagined Labour doing, first of all, taking away the winter fuel allowance was probably the last on my list. It just would never have occurred to me to even think about that as a possibility. Now, there are people who are old age pensioners who can definitely do without an additional £300 tax-free a year. And hands up, I am, I guess, one of those. I'm still in employment. I'm fit. I'm well. I'm able to heat my house. I'm incredibly fortunate. I'm lucky. I know it. But the cost of actually putting in place a benefits checking system to eliminate people like me would have been very high. And the consequences that they've chosen are very bad, if you like, a precipice benefit to actually ensure that people cannot get access to this. Pension credit is a very difficult credit to claim in the first place. It's very complicated to go through the process. It requires you to be online, and lots of pensioners aren't. And the forms are exceptionally complicated. And if you are 5p over the earnings limit, you lose that pension credit and therefore the entitlement to winter fuel allowance, which is why I call it a precipice benefit. It's either you're in or you're out. And once you're out, you're incredibly out. And therefore, lots of people are being punished. We know that at least 1/3 of all people who should get pension credit aren't getting it. And I would suggest that data exclusion is one of the reasons for that, because it is so hard to actually make the application. But also, it's a complicated process, even if you get online. But this just feels like punishment for those who are vulnerable. And I keep on hearing this phrase that Keir Starmer talks about. She said, it's always for working families. Well, That's fine, Keir, but I know quite a lot of people who live by themselves. Are they families by your definition, or do they not count? And I know quite a lot of people who don't work. I spent the weekend meeting old friends for a party, and a fair number of the people who were there were under the age of 18. They did not work. Do they count in your society, Keir? There were friends of mine who were my age who are now retired. Do they no longer count in your society? One of the people there has had ever since birth a significant difficulty with her cognition. She's able to function, but she can't work, and she's now in her 30s. Does she not count, Keir? I have this real problem with his definitions of who's on the outside and who's on the inside. And because every single comment is aimed at hard-working families, apparently if you work, you're hard-working. I don't know why he assumes that's the case, because I also know some people who earn a great deal of money who don't seem very hard-working for it. But let's leave that comment aside. The point is that this is a false presentation that he's making. Everything's binary in Keir Starmer's world. You're either a goodie or you're a baddie. You're a baddie if you don't work. You're a goodie if you do work. No, that's just not the way the world is, Keir. Actually, we live in a world of greyness. I mentioned earlier when we were talking about normal people. There are no normal people. If you're in government, you have to actually manage all types of people. And all types of people include those who are not working. And to pick on them, whether they be children in poverty because of the two-child benefit cap or because they're old, seems to me to be just about the worst thing that a Labour government could do.
Do you not buy that that might be a technicality that working people, phrase that they keep bandying about? I mean, perhaps that is an introduction or a way that they can increase capital gains tax, or they can eliminate the carried interest on private equity. Does that working people perhaps mean that, get them out of, allow them to raise those taxes? Is it necessarily within? I'm not sure I'm not sure about your definition. I mean, I understand
Well, working people, I mean, I am presuming that I will take working people in its sort of common understanding, people who go out to work, whether that be employed or self-employed. Curiously, the self-employed will pay capital gains tax because they will probably sell a business at some time. And therefore, they actually therefore will pay tax. So his hardworking family is actually very typically, if you find somebody who does pay capital gains tax, quite probably from a hardworking family. So he fails to differentiate there. And the person who's got a carried interest is actually working in a private equity fund. It may not be quite the way that most of us will recognize work, but they are actually working. They just happen to be remunerated in a very strange way in a very low tax manner. But nonetheless, by his definition of hardworking, they probably are. They probably put in very many hours to actually earn several million a year on which they don't want to pay a lot of tax. So I don't think that we can say that he's doing that to try to provide a differentiation. The differentiation that we need is to differentiate between income from work and income derived from wealth. And that is income or gains derived from wealth. I'm personally not a great fan of wealth taxes per se, simply because I think as somebody who has 40 years of experience of actually looking at the tax system from inside, I have, alongside my academic career, my campaigning career, also been a practicing chartered accountant for a long time. I am no longer, but I was for 40 years. And I think a wealth tax would be a nightmare to administer and collect for relatively low reward. But there are a great many ways in which, if he really does insist we do need new taxes, and I think it would be easier to borrow more, by the way, but if he does insist we need new taxes to fill the black hole that he claims the Tories have created, which prevent him delivering services that we require, then he could very simply equalise capital gains tax and income tax rates and make 14 billion a year. He could charge VAT on the supply of financial services by banks and other people, and that would raise £8 billion a year. Add those two together, and I just found the 22 billion he needs. It is as simple as that. That could be done like that overnight without any stress, just a line in a finance bill. Solved, Keir. Your tough decisions are over. Now get on with the job of deciding what you're going to do next for the benefit of people in this country.
And would that meet the definition of those with the broadest shoulders carrying the heavier burden?
Yeah, because let's be clear, nobody makes a capital gain unless they have significant wealth. You've got to make a gain of over 12,500 a year. The number of people who, in my experience, that I saw as a practicing accountant who made capital gains is pretty small. It's a few 100,000 at most in the whole economy a year. And they are inevitably in the wealthiest 1 or 2% of people in the economy as a whole. So they definitely have the broadest shoulders. And when we're talking about VAT on financial services, nobody buys financial services unless they're wealthy enough to have to worry about what to do with their money. In other words, they must, by definition, have the broadest capacity and broadest shoulders to bear the burden of extra tax. So these are straightforward taxes on wealth or income derived from wealth, and therefore they're easily within his definition of broader shoulders. Yes.
This budget that we're expecting in October, do you think it will meet the definition of austerity?
Yes. Do I think this budget will meet the definition of austerity? Yes, I do. What is austerity? It is a budget which is going to provide for a reduction in the required level of government spending that meets the needs of the population as it grows and as their needs grow and develop. We are not going to see the government matching those needs. It will underfund the necessary services. I'm not talking about silly services that we would all like. I mean, everybody would love a free holiday in Barbados a year, or courtesy of the government. No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about actually doing some very basic things, like making sure that people who've got cancer are seen within a couple of weeks of their diagnosis. We're talking about people who've had a heart attack actually being seen by a heart specialist, not 12 hours after they arrive in A&E, but very quickly, because that massively improves their life chances. We're talking about children with special needs getting the care and support that they require. If those things are not happening, we are going to be living in austerity. We are going to be suffering a government that is deliberately imposing hardship on the population. And that, in my definition, is austerity.
It's very confusing, though, because what you've just laid out was arguably what was sold to the electorate just a couple of weeks ago. I mean, everything you've just said about prevention, that is something that Wes Streeting has been talking about for quite some time. I mean, why are they not following through on it? Or what, are they just simply not able to follow through on the promises?
Well, first of all, we have to allow for the possibility they didn't tell us the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth during the course of the election campaign, which has happened in the history of politics. I've got to be honest with you. I think I haven't seen enough. My first election campaign was in 1970, and I haven't seen one yet where everybody's told the whole truth. So Wes Streeting might not have told you everything you wanted to know. But secondly, I think that everybody underestimated the willpower of Rachel Reeves to impose her budget constraint on anybody who had a spending department. They all lived in hope, and so many commentators lived in hope. You wait, when they get into office, they will show you that they aren't New Labour 2. They are actually something really quite radical. Well, they're not New Labour 2. No, they're George Osborne 2 at best. And we are seeing that austerity really is the mantra they're going to offer, because Rachel Reeves is like, oh, Rachel Reeves has been built in the mold of Philip Snowden. Now, most people don't know who Philip Snowden is. He became Viscount Snowden. He was, in fact, the first ever Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he served several times in that role before becoming a member of the national government, which basically sold Labour out in 1931. And he created the austerity that led to the massive recession of the 1930s, the Jarrow marches and everything else, because he believed he had to balance the books, even though we were facing an economic crisis. We do face an economic crisis now. The economic crisis is one of failing public services and our inability to deal with climate change. Those two things together amount to a crisis. If this was a war, they would find the money. If this was something else of a similar scale, like COVID, for example, they would find the money. They would create QE. Literally, before I began talking to you, I was talking to an economist who said, well, look, issue a government bond this week for £22 billion and have the Bank of England buy it back next week for £22 billion. Problem solved. Do QE if you don't want to do anything else. You could do that. There's ample capacity to sell a bond into the Bank of England because it has actually been flogging off government bonds willy-nilly for the last couple of years for no gain whatsoever, except to suppress the interest. No, sorry, except to increase the interest rate and support that. So we could actually have the Bank of England support the government to deliver everything we want. Everything is possible, but Rachel Reeves is refusing it. And I think that Oh, well, most of us, because I didn't. I believed that Rachel Reeves was really meaning what she said, that she was going to be an ironclad chancellor with ironclad fiscal rules. I don't think most people did. I think they've been sold a pup by the Labour Party. I think that there's going to be an enormous buyer's regret very soon. I genuinely believe that we have been seriously misled, and the next 5 years are going to be pretty miserable because we're going to suffer sustained austerity, at least until Keir Starmer realizes at some point, and it's going to be a year or two out yet, that his chance of being re-elected in 2029 is extremely low unless he sacks Rachel Reeves. And I would actually forecast, I think, a 2026 departure, probably late 2026 cabinet reshuffle. She'll be gone, we'll get somebody else. But who will it be? Darren Jones. He's not going to be much better, probably. Could be Torsten Bell. He, in principle, knows a bit more about this from his days at the Resolution Foundation, but is fairly neoliberal as well. I don't know who it'll be. There may be a chance at change of heart, but it isn't yet. And by then, the damage will have been done. Labour will be in deep trouble.